Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. When Donald Trump became president of the USA back in 2017, many around the world, including us here in Canada, gained a new vocabulary. And perhaps the most notable phrase which entered the English lexicon was fake news. The phrase fake news became one of the most widely used phrases and was used to denounce anything news item which was untrue. But the phrase did a whole lot more than that. It highlighted the real concern among the populace of mainstream media bias, or lamestream as Trump would call it, and the veracity of journalism. But does Canada have a fake news problem? Have journalistic standards fallen, so now editors and journalists might very well be churning out misinformation, unintentionally even? Millions of Canadians trace their roots back to countries which suffered under communism, where ideological propaganda, or agitprop as it's known, was churned out daily. As such, many Canadians already predisposed uneasily with the media. Are journalists creating the news more than just reporting on it? And what, if any, is the government's role in regulating this? Well, joining me now to discuss this is Peter Shawn Taylor, Senior Features Editor at the C2C Journal and author of the recent piece, The Fake News Fake Out. Thank you so much for joining me, Peter. I appreciate your time today. And I have to say, I was really taken by the piece that you wrote in the C2C Journal. And I thought, hey, this would be an excellent topic, one we haven't covered yet on this show. So thanks for joining me, and I guess we'll get right into it. So for our viewers' benefit, could you please explain what exactly is fake news?
Well, anyways, thanks for having me here, Tanya. I appreciate it. Well, fake news, as you said in your intro, it's kind of become a catch-all phrase. Trump used it to discredit the people that he didn't like, his opponents, and his opponents used to discredit everything Trump said, and it kind of became one of those meaningless words. Fake news is something you disagree with almost, which is clearly not the intended meaning of the concept. I think we need to establish some ground rules, and the easiest one is that fake news is news that simply is incorrect, is something that didn't happen. It's a fabrication. And once you settle on that definition that fake news is something that is provably didn't happen or
Right.
Is wrong in that way, then all the other stuff that people claim is fake news, you need to dig into, well, what is that really? And generally, it's highly biased news stories. It's events that you don't perhaps that you disagree with. Maybe it's just some people made some mistakes. It was somebody came to an early conclusion that proved to be wrong in the long run. So we need to get our facts or our definitions down first.
And I think that was a very good point to make. For example, I'm sure many of our viewers, and I'm myself as well, we've scrolled through a Facebook stream or post, and you come across some attention-grabbing headline, and you're reading this, and you said, is this true? And then all of a sudden you're Googling, did this actually happen? And then, it says bogus, not true. There's no facts whatsoever with this. And you're thinking, how could this be the case? And then you say, oh, okay, well, this is by some bogus publication I never heard of. But there are a lot of different publications out there, and perhaps we'll get to that in a little bit of a moment. But
sure.
So yes, there's fake news, which literally just made up, National Enquirer. Hopefully I'm not disparaging them by saying that, but completely tabloid. False
Bigfoot babies and that kind
of
stuff.
But in the 21st century, I feel like the word fake news, of course, coined by Trump, I suppose, really is to do with mainstream outlets who, as you said, maybe they didn't get their facts straight, or there's a spin to the story that kind of presents things in a different light. And maybe we'll start with that. So has fake news, or has concerns about misinformation, has that always existed, or is this a 21st century phenomenon?
No, it's a good point. I mean, the claims of fake news have been around for as long as there's been news, and we've gone through several eras. Not me personally, but the late around the 1890s, and you had the yellow journalism era. We had the tabloid era that was quite big in the 70s and 80s. As I said, Bigfoot babies and Elvis is alive, and on and on. So there's always been complaints that what we're seeing through the media is not true. I think what's different now is social media allows sort of the democratization of this. You no longer actually have to have a printing press in order to
Right.
produce a tabloid
And I want
that
to talk
Elvis is
about,
still alive.
exactly, and I want to talk about that social media dissemination right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're having an interesting and necessary discussion on fake news and misinformation out there, and especially in the media. Joining me is Peter Shawn Taylor, Senior Features Editor at the C2C Journal here in Canada. Thanks again, Peter, for joining me. Just before we went to commercial, we were discussing how if someone, does have, say, a tabloidish story, or if there is, some misinformation that someone seeks to spread, how easily it can be spread in this digital age of digital media and social media. Carry on with your thought there.
Yeah, so the underlying problem hasn't changed over the history of the news media, but certainly the volume of what can be distributed that might be fake or might be considered disinformation or misinformation has increased greatly. And as you said, the Trump era, and even in the last year with respect to COVID, you've been hearing a lot more about fake news. And I think it's important to when someone makes a claim of fake news, you got to stop and say, well, what do you mean? Do you mean this thing that you're talking about never actually happened at all? Or do you just mean that you disagree with the underlying premise, or that you have a different take on the issue? And I think that's what we need to get at. If we want to make any progress at all on fake news, I think we have to get our definitions down, and we have to come to some agreement on what we want the news media to do.
So one question that I've always wrestled with is when we're talking about censorship, because you're right, especially during the time of COVID, and many of us have seen this when somebody, a friend perhaps on, say, I'll use Facebook. I keep using Facebook as an example, but so many people are on that platform. Someone will post a news story or some kind of post or video on some aspect of COVID, perhaps they dispute the numbers that are being reported. Let's give that example. And then all of a sudden, Facebook will have this kind of the censorship that says, we dispute what is being said in the story. And if you want to see it, click ahead. But just a warning, we think this is false and spreading misinformation. And so I remember sometimes I would think about that and say, well, who gets to determine what is fake news? Who gets to determine who's the arbiter of that? Maybe in Canada, we'll stick to just Canada, but who gets to determine that?
Well, as you said, I mean, Facebook has to decide what goes on its platform, and so it becomes the de facto arbiter of information for anybody who's getting, scrolling through there and wanting to learn from that. So, I mean, that's clearly a problem. My article focused more on the sort of the legacy media, the newspapers and TV. And what they're doing on the fake news front. And certainly there's been lots of action. The federal government has been funding anti-fake news programs, and and sometimes even arguments about hate speech get rolled into this sort of omnibus fake news argument. So it can kind of metastasize into whatever people want to be talking about. Fake news is this kind of convenient handle to hang on things.
So does Canada have a fake news problem, a problem with misinformation with the mainstream media? We'll stick to traditional media then. Do we have a problem with this?
I mean, in terms of, if we take the narrow definition of fake news, which is reporting on things that are not true, never happened, Bigfoot baby kind of stories, I don't think we really do. I think most people are smart enough to be able to figure out, that the Queen Elizabeth isn't a reptile, and all these other kind of crazy conspiracy things, that Elvis isn't alive, et cetera, et cetera. I think where you get more into the weeds is when we start talking about heavily biased media. And certainly we've had a proliferation of that. And in many times the bias becomes sort of the accepted narrative, and anyone who wants to question, conventional wisdom becomes alleged purveyor of fake news. And I think that's a problem. And the sort of the legacy media program I was talking about in the news article for C2C about this how to spot fake news. I sort of took it apart a little bit, and most of these most of their little tools on how to spot fake news were really just sort of messaging that says that legacy newspapers are the only credible source of news, and upstart TV stations and social media organizations and anything sort of online are to be viewed with suspicion. And so I think that's a big problem, I think.
Yeah, no, you've pointed. I read when I read your journal piece there. I did see that analysis, and I would like to kind of dissect it a little bit further, perhaps when we come back from commercial break. But I found it fascinating, and I think what we should really discuss when we come back is what has been the Trudeau government response and what they've done in terms of putting a stop or trying to halt misinformation. We're going to talk about what the Trudeau government response has been, but actually I want to ask one more question. In my experience, and I've been on both sides of the camera, one as the interviewer here and one as the respondent or the one being interviewed, it seems that it's the editors who have really ultimate control, or who seem to control the spin of the story of their journalists in written paper or whatnot, with the exception of the news form, of course. We're a whole different ballgame. But anyhow, so if the editors control the story and the spin, and the corporate board controls the editors, then is there ever really any way to escape bias?
Well, no, and that's a good question. I mean, everybody has an inherent bias, and so that covers editors and corporate boards, as you mentioned, but it also covers you and me and anyone. Any writer is naturally going to have some sort of bias. As a reporter, I decide to talk to some people and not to other people, right? It's impossible. You can have a goal of being as objective as possible, but it's inevitable that your life experiences and whatever is going to influence you. I think what's important is when for news organizations to admit to their bias. Something like the Toronto Star is quite biased, but at least they claim that there's the Atkinson principles of social justice, and you can go and look it up, and that informs everything they do. They still purport to objectivity, I guess, but there's a known bias there, and that counts for most of the media. There's It used to be. In the past, it used to be far more obvious. One paper would be aligned with the Conservatives, another paper would be aligned with the Liberals.
It would be a declared bias. Am I correct?
Yes. So caveat emptor, right? I mean, the consumer of the news media then goes in knowing, okay, I'm going to get the right-wing view from this publication or this, news outlet, and then I'm going to get a left-wing view from another one. So that allows people to be informed, I guess, of what they're getting.
But now you're suggesting that kind of has eroded, that apparent bias?
Well,
or more obvious?
I think what we're now seeing is an argument where the new media, the social sort of media, is full of bias, and the older sort of legacy media are trying to burnish their reputation by claiming to sort of be more objective. And I think that's a problem. I mean, we need to recognize that everybody has biases, and not just the fact that you've been around for 150 years doesn't suddenly make you the holder of the tablets.
Right. And speaking of, we were talking about what the federal government has done in a response to fight what they call misinformation. And in 2019, and I found this interesting, and you highlighted it in your story, Trudeau spent $7 million to fight misinformation. And I said, wait, 2019, that was an election year. That was an election year, and that election happened later in the year. So I'm sure that grant wasn't given, during the election or after. To me, that reeks of political interference with independent media, or purportedly to be independent media. Am I wrong on perceiving it this way?
Well, I would certainly rather not have the federal government going around handing out money to news organizations so that they can tell everybody what's real and what's not. As I said, the part of what I got into in my story was this SPOT, how to spot fake news program that the federal government put $500,000 into, run by the legacy newspaper industry in
explain
Canada.
To our viewers what that was, the SPOT analysis.
Yes, well, it was just sort of four little tools to spot fake news. The first one I have to remind myself here, based on SPOT, is it a credible source, which was the S? Is the perspective biased, which was the P? Are other sources reporting on the same story, and is the story timely? And we got into the biased perspective, which was point two. I mean, everybody's biased. So,
Right.
so what do you gain from that?
The source
The first one
was
is
problematic.
is the source credible? Well, what does that mean? I think one of the great attributes of the social media era is that you can provide all sorts of evidence right directly in the story, right? You don't have to have a printing press anymore. You can put hot links in, you can provide other links in other ways. The one that really got me was our other sources reporting the same story, which suggests that anytime you break some new news, it's reason to be suspicious. And that used to be one of the hallmarks of, every journalist wanted to have a scoop or to cut against the grain and say things that no one else was saying. And here you've got the federal government funding this program that says don't listen to anybody who has anything different to say, which I just thought was absurd.
Yes, that definitely sounds absurd. We're going to continue on this discussion right when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on fake news in Canada and misinformation, media bias, all that fun stuff with Peter Shawn Taylor. Thank you again for joining me. You're senior features editor at the C2C Journal, and you recently wrote a story called The Fake News Fake Out. And in that, you referenced some interesting information about Canadians' perception or what they've perceived to have seen as misinformation. Do you want to expand on that? Because I found that interesting.
Sure. The whole reason we're having this discussion today is that everyone claims fake news is this huge problem that requires government attention and industry attention, and so and COVID has perhaps accentuated some of these concerns. So in February, StatsCan had quite an interesting survey where they asked people, have you seen what you consider to be misinformation about COVID online? And 96% of Canadians said yes. And the people that covered this survey said, well, this is bad news. It's it shows you how the proliferation of fake news, it's everywhere. But I think the proper way to see this is it's good news. This suggests to me that 96% of Canadians are smart enough to know that a lot of the stuff they're seeing online is not to be trusted. It may be misinformation. They may need to dig a little deeper. So if 96% of Canadians told StatsCan that they have seen misinformation online, it suggests to me that their feelers are working pretty good, that they're aware and they're treating what they see with the appropriate amount of skepticism. So, it may not be as big a problem as everyone claims it is.
Well, and whether you like Trump or didn't like Trump, I think his whole fake news, the way he drew so much attention to that subject or that phrase, it actually made people kind of perk up and say, wait, there's fake news out there? Oh, this is a thing? Oh, I should be a bit more skeptical. And so perhaps there was some, silver lining in all of that with the fake news drama, as I would call it. So I think that's right. And I think your research and your statistics speak to that people, you're right, aren't as gullible as maybe the government would make them out to be, or seems to be making them out to be, that we need all these programs and several $1 million worth of programs to help protect us innocent people who just don't understand what we're reading. When in fact, sounds like, you know what, maybe we do. We do have we do have good heads on our shoulders, so that's a good thing. Sure. Speaking more again about government spending money on programs, I think it's important to recall or to remind our viewers that with news organizations, say like the CBC, I mean, they receive almost $7 billion, $1.17 billion worth of taxpayer dollars. And I wonder about this, and a lot of people say, oh, that's crazy, it's a democratic country. Why is the government paying media? And it's definitely alarming to me. Is that still an issue here, or is this completely different than some other countries where they really do pay off their media?
Well, I think what we should take away from the CBC fact is that CBC provides a biased perspective, which should be acknowledged. And as we discussed earlier, all media has a bias, and so there's nothing wrong with that. I think what rankles a lot of people is that CBC sort of presents itself as being without bias, as the Lord's truth, so to speak, and that's because they're getting government money, they're operating in some kind of virtuous world without not beholden to advertisers or corporate boards, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the CBC needs to be treated the same way we treat every media outlet, that there is an inherent bias in there. It's actually quite strong with CBC, and it should be just as skeptical of them as anyone else. The fact that the ratings are generally so poor makes you wonder whether we're getting value for the money there as taxpayers. That would be my concern.
Okay, well, in the 30 seconds we have left of the show, do you have any last tips or advice for viewers who might want to know how they should help decipher what is misinformation or not in 20 seconds?
Well, yeah, I do. I think that if you want to solve the fake news problem, you should read broadly and think deeply. I think the real solution to misinformation out there is for everyone to inform themselves as deeply as possible using a variety of sources. Don't just rely on CBC, but don't just rely on News Forum either. They talk to everybody, or listen to everybody, read everybody, and then think about what you've seen, and that's the solution.
Okay.
To the problem.
I think you summed it up very well. Thank you again for joining me, Peter Shawn Taylor. Whether or not you think we have a fake news problem, the ultimate adjudicator of news is yourself. Check your sources, use only outlets you personally trust, and most importantly, go with your gut. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.